suspect is secure. Proceed with caution.
Elena Kozlov was 29 when she died in the arms of the creature she had loved like a son for 8 years. There were no screams of agony, no desperate struggle, just the dry sound of bones breaking in the icy silence of the Siberian afternoon, as 320 pounds of muscle and misdirected affection crushed her against the hardened snow. For a woman who had dedicated her adult life to caring for orphaned animals, dying in the affectionate embrace of a Siberian brown bear seemed like a cruel irony that even Russian folk tales could not have imagined. If Elena had known that March afternoon would be her last dance with Misha, she might have chosen a less lethal partner. In the village of Svetlogorsk, lost among the endless forests of eastern Siberia, Elena had turned the property she inherited from her grandparents into a makeshift sanctuary for injured animals. The 2-story wooden house, surrounded by 5 hectares of snow-covered taiga, was home to wounded foxes, orphaned deer, and even a lynx that had lost an eye in an illegal trap. But at the center of it all, living in a 100-square-meter enclosure adjacent to the house, was Misha, a male Siberian brown bear who had become not only the symbol of her conservationist passion, but also the emotional substitute for the son she never had. Elena had found him in September 2015, when he was just a 3-month-old cub, starving to death next to his mother's body in a remote clearing. Poachers had killed the female for her bile, leaving the baby to slowly die in the Siberian cold. If she had let nature take its course that day, he would still be alive. "Little bear," she had whispered in Russian, wrapping the trembling cub in her military parka. "You're coming with me." The nearest veterinarian was 200 kilometers away in Khabarovsk, but Elena made the journey across icy roads that looked more like skating rinks. Dr. Dmitry Volkov, a specialist in Siberian wildlife, examined the cub with professional skepticism. "He's malnourished and dehydrated," he had diagnosed. 50% chance of survival at best. "And even if he survives, you understand that you'll be raising one of Siberia's most dangerous predators?" "I understand the risks," Elena replied, stroking the cub's furry head. "But I can't let him die." How tragically wrong she was about her ability to control the future. During the first 2 years, their life together was idyllic. Misha lived in Elena's house, sleeping on a makeshift bed in the kitchen and following her around like a giant puppy. She fed him with a bottle, played with him in the snow, and even allowed him to sleep at the foot of her bed during the coldest nights of the Siberian winter. At 6 months, Misha weighed 15 kilograms. At 2 years old, he had surpassed 80 kilograms. At 5 years old, he weighed 180 kilograms and stood 2.5 meters tall when he stood on his hind legs. At 8 years old, when tragedy finally struck, he had become a magnificent 320-kilogram bear, an alpha predator perfectly adapted to survive the most brutal winters on the planet. Elena was proud of the unique relationship she had developed with Misha. Every day, regardless of the weather, she would enter his enclosure for their daily playtime, wrestling sessions that invariably ended with Misha hugging Elena as she pretended to be overpowered by the giant bear. But pretending to be overpowered by a bear and actually being overpowered are drastically different things. Dr. Boris Petrov, a biologist specializing in bears at Moscow State University, had visited Elena twice, once in 2019 and once in 2022. On both occasions, he left deeply concerned about what he had witnessed. "Elena, you need to understand that Misha is no longer a cub," he had warned during his last visit. "He's an adult bear with enough strength to break your ribs without even noticing." "Misha has known me since he was a baby," Elena had replied, as the giant bear rubbed against her legs like a domestic cat. "He would never hurt me." Dr. Petrov had watched Misha carefully during that visit, noticing signs that Elena seemed unable to recognize. The bear's hugs were becoming more intense, his play more vigorous. There was a growing strength in his movements that Elena interpreted as affection, but that any expert would recognize as potentially lethal. "Please consider transferring him to a professional sanctuary," he had pleaded. "An adult male bear has instincts you cannot control." "Never," Elena had replied with a vehemence that surprised even herself. "Misha would die of grief without me." Unfortunately, it would be Elena who died first. The afternoon of March 15, 2023 was unusually mild by Siberian standards. with the temperature reaching 8 degrees Celsius, almost tropical for a region accustomed to 30. The snow had softened slightly, creating a fluffy layer that covered the yard like a white carpet. Elena had spent the morning caring for a wounded fox that had arrived the night before, but at 2:30 p.m., she decided it was time for her daily play session with Misha. It was a tradition they had kept religiously for 6 years, ever since the bear had become too big to live indoors. It was a tradition that would prove fatal. Around 3 p.m., Elena put on her favorite red parka, the same one she had worn to rescue Misha 8 years earlier, and walked over to the enclosure carrying a bucket of fresh salmon she had gotten in Khabarovsk. Misha was lying in the shade of a century-old pine tree, quietly chewing on a branch. When he saw Elena approaching, the giant bear stood up on his hind legs and let out that low, guttural sound she always interpreted as an affectionate hello. "Hello, my big baby," Elena said softly in Russian, opening the gate to the enclosure. "Ready to play?" Misha dropped down to all fours and approached her with the heavy grace of a 700-pound predator. There was something different about his body language that afternoon, a pent-up energy that Elena attributed to the milder weather. She should have paid more attention to the signs. Elena entered the enclosure as she had done thousands of times before, leaving the bucket of fish near the gate and walking to the center of the space where they usually played. Misha followed her, his small, dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity she interpreted as eagerness to play. "Let's dance, Misha," Elena said, using the phrase she had developed to start their wrestling sessions. It would be their last dance. Misha reacted as he always did. He reared up on his hind legs, becoming a tower of muscle and fur that blocked the afternoon sun. Elena laughed and pretended to try to knock him down, pushing against his massive chest with both hands. That's when something changed. Instead of just playing resist as he usually did, Misha wrapped Elena in his furry arms with a strength she had never felt before. His arms, each the size of tree trunks, closed around her body like a biological walrus. "Misha, gentle," Elena said, beginning to feel uncomfortable pressure. Too tight. But to Misha, human words were just meaningless noise. What happened next lasted only a few minutes, but to Elena, it must have seemed like an eternity. Misha, following instincts that had been temporarily suppressed but never eliminated, tightened his embrace with increasing force. Elena tried to pull away, but she was completely immobilized by the bear's arms. She tried to talk to him, but her voice was becoming breathless as her ribs began to give way under the pressure. She tried to calm Misha by stroking his neck, but the bear was completely absorbed in what his primitive mind identified as more intense play. It was the purest display of animal strength that Siberia had witnessed in decades. The sound of ribs snapping was heard by Alexei Volkov, no relation to the veterinarian, a neighbor who lived 500 meters away and was chopping wood in his backyard. At first, he thought someone was breaking branches for firewood, but there was something about the sequence of cracks that made him stop and listen. It was Elena's bones shattering under the pressure of 320 kilograms of misdirected affection. When Alexei finally decided to investigate, it was too late. He found Elena in Misha's enclosure, her small body motionless in the giant bear's arms. Misha had finally let go of his playmate, but now sat beside her, gently nudging her body with his snout, clearly confused as to why she wasn't moving anymore. "Bože moi," Alexei whispered in horror. My God. The nearest radio station was in Svetlogorsk, but Alexei knew that even if he managed to make contact, it would take hours for any help to arrive. There was no hospital, no emergency services, just the endless silence of the Siberian taiga. Elena Kozlov had died alone, embraced by the animal she had loved more than her own life. When the authorities finally arrived 12 hours later, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. Misha had remained by Elena's body throughout the night, protecting her from the Siberian cold with his own furry body. When the officers tried to approach, the bear growled defensively, not out of aggression, but out of territorial protection. Captain Sergei Morozov, commander of the small Svetlogorsk police station, had dealt with wild bear attacks before, but never anything like this. This was not an aggressive bear that had invaded human territory. It was a domesticated animal that had simply played a little too rough. "We're going to need a vet with tranquilizer darts," he said over the radio, "and prepare a report for accidental death." It took 6 hours to sedate Misha and remove Elena's body from the enclosure. Elena's autopsy, conducted in Khabarovsk by Dr. Natasha Romanova, revealed injuries that told a story of incomprehensible force applied without malice. Multiple fractured ribs, collapsed lung, and massive internal bleeding, but no signs of violent intent. Death by chest trauma, she recorded in her official report, consistent with crushing by a large animal. No evidence of predatory attack. The marks on Elena's body showed the characteristic pattern of a bear hug. Uniform pressure applied by extremely powerful arms. There were no claw marks, no bites, no signs that Misha had tried to hurt her deliberately. It was a cruel irony. Elena had died from excessive affection. Dr. Petrov, who had warned Elena about the growing dangers, was called in to assess Misha's behavior after the incident. What he found was a clearly confused and depressed bear who refused to eat and spent hours searching for Elena in the enclosure. It wasn't an attack, he explained to the authorities. It was a case of play that exceeded human physical limits. Misha doesn't understand that humans are fragile. To a 320-pound bear, Elena was no more resilient than a rag doll. With Elena's death, Misha was officially classified as a dangerous animal by the Russian government. Unlike other countries, Russia has specific protocols for domesticated bears, but the outcome is invariably the same: euthanasia. The decision was carried out a week after Elena's death, using an overdose of sedatives administered by Dr. Petrov himself. Misha died peacefully, still searching for Elena until his last moments. He never understood what he had done, Dr. Petrov noted grimly. For him, it was just a normal day of play. Thus ended two extraordinary lives, one that loved beyond caution, and another that played too hard. Misha's enclosure was dismantled by local authorities, and the wood was burned, following protocols for disease prevention. The other animals from Elena's sanctuary were redistributed to professional reserves. The property was sold by her family, who could not bear the memories of what had happened there. Alexei Volkov, the neighbor who had discovered the body, developed a severe phobia of bears that forced him to move to a larger city. He never fully recovered from the image of Elena in Misha's arms. The tragedy had claimed more victims than just Elena and Misha. Bear behavior experts from across Russia studied Elena and Misha's case, trying to understand how 8 years of harmonious coexistence had ended in accidental death. Dr. Elena Smirnova, an ethologist at the Russian Academy of Sciences, offered an explanation that has become widely accepted in the international scientific community. The problem was not that Misha became aggressive, she explained. The problem was that Elena constantly underestimated the strength of an adult male bear. According to Dr. Smirnova, Siberian brown bears are able to regulate their strength when interacting with cubs of their own species, but they do not have the same mechanism for humans. Elena weighed 55 kilograms. To Misha, she was no tougher than a twig. When he decided to play a little more energetically that day, he simply applied too much force. The lesson was clear. Size matters, and love does not alter the laws of physics. Today, 3 years after Elena Kozlov's death, her case has become a mandatory study in wildlife management programs throughout Russia. Universities use her story to teach about the limits of domestication and the dangers of false trust in large animals. Stricter regulations have been implemented for the ownership of rescued bears. It is now mandatory to have professional facilities and constant veterinary supervision for any bear weighing more than 220 pounds, a rule that has become known as the Kozlov Protocol. Dr. Petrov, who had tried to warn Elena and later euthanized Misha, has become a leading advocate for these regulations. Elena was an extraordinary woman with a pure heart, he often says in his lectures. But a pure heart is no substitute for basic physics. A 320-kilogram bear is a force of nature, not a pet. Her death was not in vain if it serves to save other lives, both human and animal. In the small cemetery in Svetlogorsk, covered with snow 9 months of the year, a simple plaque marks Elena's grave, mother of the taiga orphans. It is an accurate epitaph, but incomplete. Elena did not die because she loved too much. She died because she confused animal kindness with an awareness of human frailty, controlled strength with limited strength. Misha, in his 8 years of captivity, never ceased to be a wild Siberian brown bear. He simply learned to tolerate and even enjoy human presence, but never developed the ability to calibrate his enormous strength to fragile human bodies. There was no villain in this tragedy, just a woman who trusted beyond safety and an animal who played according to his powerful nature. Elena Kozlov's final dance still echoes today through the silent forests of Siberia as a grim reminder. In nature, there are no domestic animals, only temporarily gentle predators, and kindness is not the same as safety.